Welcome everyone. My name is Marlene Leonidas Gonzalez, and I am the Communication and Outreach Coordinator here at the Latin American and Iberian Institute at the University of New Mexico. The LAII, as we call it, promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through our public programming. We'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. I'd like to now pass the Zoom mic over to Dr. Luis Teran Avila from UNM's Department of History, who will introduce today's speakers. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marlene, as always, for all your support with these events. And of course, thanks to LAII for sponsoring, for just providing the general support for, again, for this very exciting event, very exciting to host my colleague and friend, Alan Shane Dillingham. Also, thanks to the History Department for providing the impulse to do these events. And thanks to those of you who are joining us on a Friday afternoon to talk about this exciting book by, again, our guest, Dr. Shane Dillingham, and I will introduce him now. Dr. Dillingham is an historian and professor. He is also a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. He is currently assistant professor of history at Albright College, but also announcing the fantastic news. We're all very happy for this. He's taking up a position at Arizona State University. And we're very happy about that because he's going to be closer to us. And we hope to continue this collaboration. And also, maybe in the near future, we can bring him to campus, have some green chile chicken enchiladas and whatnot. So again, going with the formalities, he's of course the author of the book that brings us together today, Oaxaca Resurgent, a book panel. No, that's not the title of the book. Indigeneity, Development, and Inequality in 20th-Century Mexico, published by Stanford University Press. He has also taught at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, Spring Hill College in Alabama. He serves in the organizing collective of the Tepoztlán Institute for the Transnational History of the Americas, a very important and rich venue for all things Latin America. His research focuses on the historical experiences of native peoples in the Americas, particularly with this book, 20th Century Mexico, the intersection of anti-colonial politics and educational and development policy, labor, youth-led social movements, so on and so forth. So I want to thank Shane for joining us today. I will also introduce one of our panelists, because this is indeed not just a book presentation and a celebration of Dr. Dillingham's work, but also a conversation around these themes. So joining us today is Dr. Yolanda Teran. She has been working at UNM in different projects and departments, including Native American Studies. And she's a part-time faculty at Native American Studies and the Honors College. She has extensive experience in the topics that Shane's book deals with, such as Indigenous education, languages, and different sorts of protocols in Latin America. Her research focuses on culturally appropriate curriculum, Indigenous peoples, biodiversity, traditional knowledge, environmental policy, really a vast expertise. She has served as Indigenous Peoples as the regional coordinator for the Latin American Workshop on Indicators, and also as a member of the United Nations informal committees for gender plan, digital sequence information, and the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. So we have, I am very happy to have Yolanda Teran here with us. We had scheduled to also have Dr. Tiffany S from Native American Studies. She had a little bit of a family emergency. She's not going to be able to be with us, but I'll chime in with some also discussion points for our conversation. So to get us started, Dr. Alan Shane Dillingham, please, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Luis. And thank you, obviously, to the University of New Mexico for the invitation, and the Institute, Latin American Iberian Institute, the Department of History, Marlene for hosting. I really appreciate the invitation to share some of my ideas today. I would love to be there in New Mexico with all of you, but since that's not possible right now, it's good to be able to do this virtually. I also want to thank in advance Dr. Yolanda Teran for agreeing to participate and discuss some of the ideas in the book. I really appreciate her generosity in doing so. And so what I thought I would do in terms of my portion of this event was to just share a bit about how I came to write this book. I oftentimes kind of find it interesting to know what the intellectual and personal kind of trajectories are that lead to a book. And so I thought I might share a bit of that with you all. And then I thought I could share what I think are two of the major contributions or interventions the book makes. I do a number of different things in the book, and I would love to talk about different topics or questions that people have. But I thought I'd highlight these two major contributions that I was trying to make, and then leave time for Luis or Yolanda, other people in the audience to ask questions, make comments. I really value the dialogue portion of these events, so I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible. So this book really began in the summer of 2006. I was about to start a PhD program at the University of Maryland, and I had enrolled in a Mexican history kind of graduate seminar that was organized in Oaxaca City in southeastern Mexico. And that seminar was basically a kind of a boot camp in Mexican historiography that took place over the summer. And so I enrolled in that and found myself there studying in Oaxaca City, which is the state capital of Oaxaca. It's located in a kind of high altitude central valleys of southern Mexico. And that seminar proceeded as normal seminars do, with readings, invited guest lectures, etc. Me trying to learn as much as I could about the history of Mexico in a short amount of time. But what I think made that experience important for me is that it intersected with what had been a traditional spring strike of Oaxacan primary school teachers that took place usually on May 1st, International Workers' Day. And so since basically 1980, Oaxacan teachers had been striking on May 1st to make demands for improvements in working conditions, improvements in school supplies, etc. And they had also been striking to kind of challenge the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, which had dominated that trade union for much of the 20th century. And so typically over the course of the few decades where teachers had been actively striking on May 1st, this strike would start on May 1st. Teachers would enter into negotiations with the state governor and the Ministry of Education, and then they would reach some negotiated settlement. So by the early 2000s, that strike had basically become a kind of spring ritual, right? Something that was normal, to be expected, and fairly predictable in its outcomes. But 2006 became historic because the strike did not go as planned. Rather than negotiate with the striking teachers, the Oaxacan governor at the time, a man by the name of Ulises Ruiz Ortiz, a member of the ruling party, the PRI, decided not to negotiate, to cut off negotiations, and instead send in riot police to put down and remove the striking teachers from the center of Oaxaca City. Teachers had traditionally occupied the Oaxacan, the downtown capital and the center plaza, and the governor sent in riot police, had helicopters flying above, shooting tear gas from the helicopters into the crowds to remove people. And so this kind of violent repression on the part of the government turned this kind of traditional annual strike and negotiated settlement kind of upside down. And so that initial repression first was successful. It removed the teachers from the city center, but eventually the teachers regrouped. The government's repression sparked a lot of sympathy among outside observers and Oaxacan civil society. And so over the course of the subsequent months, that annual strike became a very large social movement that involved hundreds of thousands of people that quickly went beyond just the teachers union, section 22 of the Mexican Teachers Union, and included large parts of Oaxacan civil society, nonprofits, Catholic organizations, anarchist collectives of urban youth, a whole kind of diversity of actors who were united in calling for the overthrow of the governor. That was the demand to get rid of Ulises Ruiz Ortiz, but also to try to create a different type of Oaxacan society, a new Oaxacan state constitution. And so that seminar that I was participating intersected with this historic social movement, and meant that when I tried to go to the seminar meetings, sometimes the streets were blocked. Teachers had commandeered buses and blocked traffic. Much of the city center was controlled by striking teachers. That included garbage collection, security details. Teachers basically ran the downtown. And so kind of enthusiastic supporters of the movement called it the Oaxacan commune, right? Making parallels to the Paris commune. And so me witnessing that, I wanted to try to understand what was happening, right? This kind of sparked all sorts of questions about why were the teachers striking? Why was the government so intent on repressing them? And where did this groundswell of popular support come from, right? This kind of massive, there were demonstrations with 250,000 people, and Oaxaca's population was only about 3 million at the time. So there's very large demonstrations and popular support for the movement. And so the book really starts there in 2006 with me trying to understand that conflict and that social movement. And as I, tried to understand that, I spoke with Oaxacan activists and Oaxacan intellectuals who kind of counseled me on how to think about it. And so, some of them talked about the history of this dissident trade unionism, in which, even though for the majority of the 20th century, the Mexican National Teachers Union had been controlled by the PRI, and this kind of top-down, you might in English call it yellow dog unionism or charista unionism, that there had emerged at the end of the 1970s and the 1980s, this dissident wing of teacher unionism. And so I was learning about that. And then many of these Oaxacan intellectuals encouraged me to look at the history of bilingual teachers, teachers who official kind of employment category is that of maestro bilingüe, or a bilingual teacher. That is, they're bilingual in an indigenous language, their native language, and Spanish. And they argued that these teachers had a kind of distinct history compared to the rest of the teachers union, that they operated as a kind of radical current within the mainstream union. And so I heeded that advice from these Oaxacan intellectuals, and to try to get closer to the history of these bilingual teachers, I spent 3 years studying Tu'umsavi, or Mixtec, which is one of 16 different officially recognized native languages in Oaxaca. Mixtec is one of the larger languages. It has over 500,000 speakers at this point. And so studying Mixtec over the course of those 3 years connected me to a whole network of bilingual teachers and indigenous language activists. And so that language work was really important in terms of understanding the conflict and understanding the history of indigenous education. And so, what emerged was me kind of taking that 2006 movement and looking backwards at the history of indigenous education and indigenous development in Oaxaca. And so these efforts at indigenous education and indigenous development in Latin America are oftentimes referred to as indigenismo, right? This state project to modernize, educate, or integrate indigenous populations. And so, the book that I've ended up writing, Oaxaca Resurgent, in many ways is a kind of social history of indigenista policies in the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca during the 20th century. And so one way to kind of characterize the book is that I use Oaxacan history to understand the broader history of indigenista policies in Mexico, but I also try to frame it within some broader kind of hemispheric examples. Now, in terms of what I think are a couple of the major contributions, the orthodox narrative of indigenista policies in the Americas is that indigenismo was fundamentally a state project that defines a kind of indigenous other as a problem in need of modernization, right? And obviously the Indian problem was the language that was often used, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, for many indigenista thinkers. But the orthodox critique is that this project was basically a top-down homogenizing project that was ultimately antithetical to indigenous interests, right? While indigenismo might have celebrated pre-Hispanic pasts, right, and celebrated pre-Hispanic ruins and certain aspects of indigenous cultures or kind of handicrafts, indigenismo was ultimately, was at best folkloric and at worst kind of colonialist in its treatment of native peoples, right? And that critique really coalesces in the late 1960s and early 1970s among dissident anthropologists as well as an indigenous activists who are increasingly speaking for themselves during that period. And so I think that critique, which coalesces in the late 60s and early 70s, remains the kind of dominant way of thinking about indigenismo in Latin America. And while I sympathize with that critique, I think it has a lot of validity. I think that is kind of just one part of the story, right? That if we leave our understanding of indigenismo in Latin America as just a kind of top-down state homogenizing project, which is, a bad thing and kind of just we should move on from. If we think about it only in that way, we're missing a large part of the history. And so one of the main interventions that I try to make in the book is to say that indigenismo, whether in its form as education policy or policy around archaeological sites or public health campaigns or development policy in terms of agriculture or other forms of indigenous development, that none of these policies ever went without a response by the targeted population. That is, indigenous people were always engaging with, sometimes rejecting, sometimes negotiating, sometimes selectively incorporating indigenista policies and using it for their own ends. And so that's kind of one of the central contributions, right? That indigenous people are always engaged. They are never passive recipients of government policy, but rather doing all sorts of creative, innovative things with it. And so I try to, over the course of the book, look at multiple generations of indigenous actors who are oftentimes employed by the federal government or state development agencies and who articulated their own ideas vis-a-vis indigenista policy, right? And so I look at these different generations, some of which kind of come of age in the 1950s, others come of age in the late 60s and early 70s, and then others in the early 1980s, who all are engaging with these projects and challenging them, placing limits on government officials' ideas, redefining their own ideas of what development means, and oftentimes using positions within government agencies to think about broader kind of bottom-up campaigns to transform Indigenous communities and think about how can we arrive at what we might call Indigenous liberation, right? That over the course of the 20th century, there's multiple generation of intellectuals, Indigenous intellectuals, who have different ideas about how to achieve that. So I think that's one of the central interventions I make in the book. The other intervention that I'd like to highlight before I we can move to other people's comments and questions is in some ways drawing on this focus on Indigenous activism and Indigenous agency, which is that I look at, in particular, Indigenous youth activism in the 1970s as a way to rethink two phenomenon which shape kind of all Latin American societies in the second half of the 20th century. And that is the rise of official multiculturalism and the rise of what we oftentimes call movements of Indigenous resurgence. And just to kind of explain what I mean by those two things. So, you know, in the last few decades of the 20th century, throughout Latin America, whether it's Bolivia, Mexico, Guatemala, you could pick a country, even I think you could find examples of this in the United States and Canada, we see governments increasingly take initiatives towards officially acknowledging and embracing Indigenous people's presence and cultural and linguistic diversity. And so you see, for example, constitutional amendments that acknowledge the pluriethnic nature of individual states in the Western Hemisphere. You see reforms within national education laws, moving from a focus on Spanish language acquisition to an embrace of bilingual instruction, or what later is termed intercultural education, to kind of valorize native languages as of equal value to national languages. You see these types of reforms taking place in countries throughout the Americas. You also see institutions like the International Labor Organization and other international institutions officially recognizing and kind of embracing Indigenous rights and diversity in all sorts of ways. And so one of the ways that I try to think about that phenomenon is that many critics, and I think this is a kind of orthodox position among many scholars, many critics have stressed the superficial nature of these multicultural reforms, right? That while governments have acknowledged Indigenous diversity or Indigenous languages in legal reforms or educational reforms, that these amount to kind of superficial gestures, that there's little substantive support for this, and that this is a way, for some critics, they argue, this is a way to talk about difference without reckoning with persistent inequalities that Indigenous people face, right? And so I think this is a dominant way that people understand the rise of multiculturalism, or what some call neoliberal multiculturalism. That is, these reforms are a way to change everything so that everything remains the same, right? According to some critics. And so one of the ways that I try to push back against that interpretation is by centering the actions of Indigenous activists in the 1970s, who very much were interested in demanding bilingual education and culturally relevant education for their communities and for the kind of national education systems they found themselves in. And so rather than just talk about multiculturalism and what you would describe as a narrative of defeat, right? That, oh, multiculturalism is superficial and it doesn't really fully achieve what we want it to achieve. I try to show that this is also a concession to grassroots demands in Latin America during this period. And I think you could find parallels in North America, and say, for example, fights around ethnic studies or the rise of Chicano studies, others, programs like that in the 1970s in the United States. And then the way that I try to rethink the origins and nature of indigenous resurgence in the Americas is also by centering the 1970s. And so much of the way that people have talked about movements of indigenous resurgence has stressed a rupture between dominant politics of nationalist or class-based politics towards a politics focused on ethnicity or identity, right? And so scholars have oftentimes said, okay, we've had these movements of campesino-based movements or class-based workers movements in the first half of the 20th century. And then we see in the 70s and 80s this kind of shift towards a politics of ethnicity or identity, and that is this break, a kind of political break in terms of discourse and official politics. And the kind of a sharp contrast between ideas of class and ethnicity. And in some ways, and we can talk about this in discussion, what I try to say about this phenomenon of indigenous resurgence is rather than stress the kind of rupture, I stress continuity. That is, that there are many movements, political actors, activists, organizations that are engaged in a politics of class or other kind of left-wing politics in the mid-20th century, who have connections to the rise of indigenous rights activism in the 60s and 70s. That is, there's not this hard rupture in which people throw out class politics and embrace a politics of indigeneity, but rather that there's a kind of a continuity that people are oftentimes, the indigenous youth that I profile in chapter 4 of the book, are engaged with left-wing politics, but are trying to think about how do a politics of, say, Marxism, how do they relate to the particular nature of the indigenous communities that they live and work in, right? And how do you think about Marxism in a context of communities that are still run through usos y costumbres, or indigenous customary law, basically a kind of communal form of governance. And so rather than a kind of break, these folks are using more universal ideas of, Marxism or revolution, but thinking about them in the kind of particularity of the situation that they find themselves in. And so I think that for me was important to focus on continuity and to think about how activists, particularly indigenous activists in the 1970s, were thinking about their struggles as part of a universal struggle against colonialism, right? That they were kind of connecting their singular experiences with a global struggle for social change and for a better world. And I thought that was something that I found interesting, kind of as a historical moment that had been overlooked in the 1970s, but also one that I think helps us think about and imagine a better future today, about how do we reckon with the kind of singular experiences that many of us have in terms of facing oppression or marginalization, while also elaborating a politics that is one that can connect us all in a struggle for a better world. So I could go on, but I feel like I've been speaking maybe for a bit, so I'm happy to cede my time, and thank you all for listening and look forward to the conversation.
So thank you, Shane, for again just providing such a concise and rich overview of what you did with this book. So what I'll do now is I will again make my intervention. I'll try to be super brief, and not so much with reviewing the book or anything of that sort, but maybe with posing just a few questions that that we can consider, right, together with the audience, and that maybe we can, to get us started, let's just say, with this dynamic of conversation, right? So the first thing it would be to note that one of the first things when I saw just when your book was about to come out, Shane, just the title of the book, right, Oaxaca Resurgent, and immediately I thought resurgent and insurgent, right? And there is something to that idea, no? That Oaxaca has been for such a long time a place in Mexico considered perhaps together with Guerrero, to be a sort of an insurgent place, right? A place of difficult politics, to put it lightly. You know? So that idea itself of insurgency and insurgent was kind of in my mind. And as I started reading your book, I also thought about whether part of what you're trying to show to us is, without, let's say, conceding too much to Indigenismo, right? And as you were saying, keeping the idea that Indigenismo had, was a state project and had all of these sort of negative aspects to it, that there were many instances and attempts and moments, and we can even, perhaps this is a question also today, no? Whether Indigenismo was also insurgent and in some sort subversive, right? Whether what you're trying to show is a kind of radical side to these appropriations of Indigenismo, right? And of course, I guess a lateral question there would be, is this Indigenismo at all, right? Are we talking about the same thing, right? Are we not talking about just radicalism and so on and so forth? That's kind of one first set of ideas and questions that I had for you. Another thing that struck me, this is particularly, I guess, part of your introduction in the book, that you talk about how your contribution is also about deprovincializing Mexico, right? Kind of stop talking about Mexico. We should stop talking about Mexico as this particular unique case in Latin America, and really try to integrate it better with not just Latin America, but with the world. Also, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that here. And lastly, at least for this, my round of questions or comments, the notion of development and how you, let's say, historicize it and how you humanize it, I think is a very important aspect of your book, right? Just like Indigenismo, right, we tend to see development as a sort of project from above, right, a Cold War project, right? And I think what you show, and maybe you could also speak a little bit more about, again, that granular level of development initiatives, right? We see that development is really, or also the result of interactions, contestations, negotiations, and this very interesting term that I think you use several parts of your book, of refusal, right? Which I really like that. I don't know if it's a contrast or a kind of companion to the idea of resistance, right? The idea of refusal is also very important, it seems, in your story, no? So I'll leave it there with my round of questions, and perhaps we can, I guess I would like to give the mic to Yolanda, who can probably give us, just a much broader set of perspectives about your book. Yolanda, you want to go ahead?
Oh, yes. Okay, I don't know. I think I have a problem with my camera, but at least you hear me. Okay. Now it's fine. So thank you so much. First, I would like to begin congratulating Dr. Shane. Usually to make a research and to go deep in a specific topic, especially you being from here and trying to write and to do something about another country, other indigenous peoples, should be very difficult. So when you explain why you decided to make this research, for me, it's very good to know that, because when I read the book yesterday, I received it, I was thinking, oh, this is my first time really knowing that a person from here is really having attention and trying to do something for our indigenous brothers and sisters from Mexico. And so what I did is I went through the whole book and I highlight a few words, few concepts that caught my attention. And I should say that you, with the book, you brought me back when I was a child. And sometimes you think that you already forgot your problems, your limitations as an indigenous person, as an indigenous woman, which is not true. For instance, I was very touched in the page number 2, when you are speaking about racial types. That happens to me. When I was 18 years old, the Museum of the Central Bank contracted me as the first indigenous woman as a worker for the museum. And so I should say I was well respected. I was doing very well my job, you know, trying to explain the non-indigenous peoples, the roots of indigenous peoples in Ecuador and also in Latin America. But one day, one anthropologist came to our office. And it happens that at that time, we have 4 indigenous people working in the museum. And he called them, the 3 of them, you know, and I didn't understand what was going on inside. And then I have the curiosity and asked the receptionist, what is going on there? Why they don't call me? Because also I am indigenous. And so I don't know what she did, but the anthropologist, he came and said, you know, we cannot have your measures of your body, of your face, and also of your teeth or anything, because you don't look as an indigenous. For being indigenous, you need to have a dark color in your face. You need to be a little more fat, like a round face, a round body, and you are not like that. And so he said, I should say that you are not indigenous. And I was, oh, okay, no problem. But then it was the time when in the museum also some photographers come. They came to, you know, to do certain jobs over there. And then they immediately, they were like, oh, the indigenous peoples, they have another type of skin, the color is different. And they wanted to touch even my skin. And I didn't allow that and say, no, I don't allow that because I am a human being like you. So I'm not going to allow this. And from that, you know, yesterday I was thinking, always there was the violation to our rights. They never consulted us. They never expect to have our free, prior, and informed consent. No, and this has been like that since the time of the conquest. They just came and destroyed everything without even respecting who we are, who we were as people. So that is one thing that I wanted to share with you. And then, of course, in other page, I think it's page 5, there is a paragraph about agenda and negotiations. Unfortunately, that is the truth. Even for me, even for my brothers and sisters, I mean, in the world, every day we need to see what is going on and then to think how we are going to negotiate. I remember clearly when I was coordinating a specific project for indigenous peoples inside this, this framework of indigenismo or el desarrollo para los indígenas, something like that. So I was very happy that I was called to develop the first project for Latin America about community, I mean, museums for communities. And so everything was well. They accepted my proposal. They accepted the way how I define the community. But there was a change when the people from a certain community from Ecuador decided to come to a general assembly with the president of Ecuador and some ministers to speak about this pioneer project. I noticed that there was something happening there. I didn't want to accept that, but then I tried to understand and to learn what was going on. And then I asked for a meeting with the Secretariat for Indigenous Affairs. And so I asked him if something was wrong. If it's that, I would like to apologize because I don't understand what we did wrong. And he said, you know what? I would accept everything from indigenous peoples, from your side. And he himself was an indigenous person. And so I said, yeah, but I don't see the point. And he said, you see, the indigenous, they need to talk to me always with their eyes looking the floor. They were always speaking to me, looking at my eyes. That is a lack of respect. So he said, if they are going to continue coming to my office and speaking in that way, so they are not welcome. I was shocked. I was shocked because I was the one teaching my people why, when you are speaking or doing something, you are looking the floor. Why? You need to look the eyes. You need to look the face of the other people. I was the one teaching that. And then it seems that I was broken the protocol over there. And so I couldn't lie and I couldn't hide this. And so I went to see the community members. They were waiting outside. We had like 300 people. They came from long distance only for this meeting. And I said, look, I never lied to you. So this is what is happening. So they said, okay, we don't want any more that project. We are going to stop the project. We don't want these people coming to our community. So, you know, we have like 6 months of negotiations, trying to understand the one side, trying to understand the government side. At the end, we said, no, we don't need the project. So in that case, they were practicing the self-determination. Indigenous people self-determination. And of course, the authorities from the state, they never understood that. Just they say, oh, it's a problem. They don't want our money. They don't want really to be developed. They don't want to be modernized. And so this is another concept that you use that you refer in the book. So I was thinking, even in my personal case, what has been the meaning of modernizing? What is the meaning of being in the other side? That means that you need to leave your indigenous side and to negate, to say, no, I'm not indigenous, I am Latino, or I am in the other side. So comes those thoughts to my mind. And it's really a critical and complex issue because right now, for instance, with the COVID, what had more importance, our traditional knowledge, being indigenous, or the Western medicine, which never came to our communities in Latin America? And so I keep asking to myself, what is the meaning of modernismo? What in this concept, in this context right now, would be the new parameters to understand the modernismo? No, of course, the history and the concepts are not static, they are always changing. But I think those concepts should be coming from indigenous peoples themselves. And so this is why I'm saying that every day we have to negotiate. Every day we need to see what we are going to say, what we are going to do. And so in that regard, always we are very active. Many of indigenous peoples from Latin America, they don't like to be called activists, but every day we are dealing with that. Because even if it's in education, we need to see that, for instance, during the COVID, the 90% of communities without internet connection. How you are going to receive a Zoom or webinar class? Impossible. Most of the students, they were climbing to the trees to get the signal for the internet. And so many things happen inside the education. For instance, and I agree totally with this strike in Oaxaca and in other places, always the indigenous education system has a less budget. For instance, in Latin America, if you receive the 2% of the total budget of the nation, is too much. So 2% to pay the administrative fees, to pay the salaries, to attend the whole necessities. So usually what, for instance, in Ecuador, the system is working, it was working before the COVID with with international financial aid. So I don't know now how is that, but we depend on that. And on the top of that, if you only see the infrastructure, try to see how the buildings are. No electricity, no water, no public batteries, no bathrooms for the students. So how they are going to be? There are no desks. I mean, there are several needs. And in the middle of that, we have teachers who are teaching one teacher for 2 or 3 grades, or one teacher for 6 grades. So I was one of those teachers. It's not easy to work, in the same room. You have to divide it and to know until here is first grade, the second grade, things like that. So there are so many things that we need to put attention. And on the other hand, if you see, if you want to see how the indigenous children, they don't respond in class, or why they fell down and sleep, because they go to work first in the field at 3 and 4 a.m. and then they come back, they maybe eat something and they run to the school, sometimes without any breakfast. And so, according to UNESCO, we know that the first meal, the most important meal, is the breakfast. And we don't have that. And the other issue, if we see the statistics from UNESCO, we need like a decade to break down this vicious circle. They always said, if the mother is not educated, so the future of the children is going to be very, very poor, very sad. But if the mother is educated, then she's going to break out this sad and very poor circle. So there are so many things that you put me to think with your book. I have plenty of ideas and things that I was reflecting on, but I think I will stop there. If there is a second round, I will try to add more comments. But for me, it's like you press a button and put me to remember what I thought that I already forgot. Is not, is there. It's not in pain, but it's giving me the ideas and being aware that still we need to do several things for our people in everywhere in the world. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you, Yolanda. That was powerful and rich. And I mean, Shane, what else can you ask, right? When a reader with the experience and the expertise of Yolanda tells you to your virtual face, this made me think of all of these things, right? So if you want to again respond to our comments and questions, now is your turn.
Sure, no, absolutely. And thank you so much, Luis and Yolanda. Really appreciate your all's thoughtful engagement with the work and comments and questions. I mean, I think, just maybe I can begin and go in reverse order with Yolanda's comments and thoughts first. I mean, I really do appreciate so much, the way that you talked about the resonance of the book with your own life and your own experiences. And I think that, that does say something about the way in which Native peoples across the hemisphere have had to confront very similar circumstances and racism and government projects, to change them in particular ways. I mean, I think, I'm oftentimes in conversations about Indigenous education. I work on the history of Indigenous education, but obviously, as you are pointing to, there's all these current debates about Indigenous education and how best to structure it. And, there's discussions about using Indigenous languages, Spanish, Also, of course, the instruction in English. Increasingly, there's a demand that Native children are taught English. And, you know, a lot of this kind of falls into kind of policy and like what's the best pedagogical approach or what are the best didactic materials. But I think what you are mentioning, Yolanda, and what I have seen in the research that I've done in Mexico is that you can have the best, you know, on the books, you know, intercultural bilingual education, but if it is consistently underfunded, if there are, you know, schoolrooms that are, you know, leaking water, that don't have computers, that don't have desks, they don't have just the kind of basic materials, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I don't want to say it doesn't matter at all, but those kind of national changes don't matter that much if you are existing in a context of endemic poverty. And in the case of Oaxaca, you know, you have teachers trying to teach in context, just as you said, Yolanda, where their children are first working in the fields before they come to school. They might come to school hungry. And then, of course, they're in a context of large-scale outmigration, in which many of the older people of the community, grandparents and parents, are leaving, or rather parents are leaving, and sometimes the children stay with the grandparents. And so it's hard, I think, I mean, I shouldn't say it's hard, but it's frustrating when people ask that Indigenous education solve all these problems, when in fact, these are very large structural economic problems that the best teacher couldn't address by themselves, right? That you have to kind of address the entire context that Indigenous people are facing, not just changing the language in education policy. And certainly, I mean, I think your point about how Indigenous people, as we have, you know, as national states and governments have said, you need to modernize, that has oftentimes said, you need to shed part of yourself. That is, to be modern, you need to stop being Indigenous. You need to stop speaking your language, or you need to stop certain cultural practices. And I think that that is, you know, this binary that Native people have faced all over the Americas, and that at our best, we see moments in which Indigenous peoples have refused that and said, right, I can be Indigenous and be modern, right? And if you look at a place like Oaxaca, you have, and you know, Indigenous people engaged in all sorts of, you know, I think very exciting, modern, cosmopolitan behavior, thinking about their relationship to the land and the international economy and what they can do and what products that can be marketed, et cetera. And I think we have to kind of reject this dichotomy, which is you're either Indigenous or modern, right? But that Indigenous people have had to be modern, you know, since the conquest. They've had to engage in people who are radically different. They've had to think about new economies, new cultures. And that in some ways is the very definition of being modern, right? Is your ability to kind of negotiate with people other than yourselves. And so, but I think you're right to draw our attention to that. The other thing, I mean, maybe I could turn, there's more I have to say about Yolanda's comments, but maybe just as for parity, I can, for Luis, thank you so much. I mean, we could probably spend an hour talking about each one of your questions and comments. The question of the title, you know, the title, of course, Oaxaca Resurgent is a title that was negotiated with the press, right? So there's a lot of back and forth about what the title should be. But I think you pinpointed the crux of the actual debate that we were having, you know, behind the scenes, was whether it was resurgent or insurgent and what were the stakes of those different words. And so certainly insurgent was an idea that I had as a working title for a long time. You know, when I was coming up, I had Insurgent Mexico, John Reed's little book about the Mexican Revolution, in my back pocket. And I thought of Oaxacan history as part of this kind of larger insurgent history. And I think so, you know, that was very important. But I think in some ways we landed on Oaxaca Resurgent because it allowed us to kind of reference or gesture to this question of Indigenous resurgence. But I think lots of people working on Indigenous history and politics have, I think, rightly questioned the term resurgent as in some ways, at times kind of implying that there is this essential indigenous kind of condition that has resurged, right? And so some scholars, I think, rightly say, well, is resurgent a problematic term because it seems to suggest that there's this essential indigeneity that then resurges at one point. But for me, it was about trying to make Oaxacan history speak to these broader debates. And so I thought there was a kind of practicality to the term. But certainly, for example, I'm trying to think about having the book translated into Spanish and published in Mexico. And so the question of how to translate the title or come up with an alternative title is an important one. And I don't think it would be like Oaxaca Resurgent, or something. I actually think you would have to come up with a very different title. And so and maybe it would be Insurgente. But if people have suggestions, please pass me your suggestions. In terms of, I think, Luis's other comment about could the Indigenismo have an insurgent history, or is Indigenismo, insurgent, or can we not categorize it as that? And there's a few things that we could say about that. Firstly, in the research for the book, I used a number of declassified government surveillance documents, right, that were declassified in the early 2000s and then reclassified under Peña Nieto. And I use those documents for all sorts of things, but one of the things to say is that government spies did think indigenista policy could be a threat. And they thought it was kind of insurgent, right? And so government spies are spying on anthropologists who work for the Instituto Nacional Indigenista. They're worried about anthropologists' relationships to indigenous communities. And so there's parts of the state that thought Indigenismo could be insurgent, or at least some kind of threat to national security that was worth watching. And then I think the other thing to say is that there's different generations of Indigenista kind of professionals. And some of those professionals understood their work as a kind of radical project. For example, I profile a Mixtec teacher and he eventually becomes a director of indigenous education, Ramon Hernandez Lopez, who's from San Agustin Tlacotepec, which is high in the kind of Mixteca Alta in Western Oaxaca. And he, thought of his work as empowering indigenous communities, as providing literacy through bilingual instruction. He oftentimes found himself in conflicts with local caciques, or kind of regional strongmen who were big landowners, who were kind of economic elites. And so, in times he kind of had to be physically defended from, attacks by these local elites, by the Mexican army. And so, like Ramon Hernandez Lopez, he thought that he was being a kind of radical by using federal state resources to challenge kind of local elites. And so in that way, I think he thought of his work as insurgent. Now, the next generation of indigenous activists, some of whom are also employed by the federal state, they kind of take a very different view, and they think that the state, that you can't actually do radical insurgent political activity through the state. They actually think that people like Ramon Hernandez Lopez were facilitating kind of state penetration of indigenous communities. And so they both, the Ramon Hernandez Lopez generation and the kind of late 60s, early 70s generation, believe they're doing kind of anti-colonial radical work, but they have different ideas about how one would do that, and different ideas about whether the state could ever be a venue for that. And so, I do think that I try to look at ways that people creatively engage with the state and state policy. But of course, at the end of the day, the state is a state project, not a project to eliminate itself, but rather to maintain the kind of existing order. And so there's probably, I think, some level of a certain limitation to the state. There's a story that I detail, I think, in chapter 6 about an anthropologist, Salomon Namad, who's a Mexican anthropologist of Syrian ancestry. And he wanted to basically radicalize the INI and place indigenous leaders and activists at the head of many INI offices in the late 70s and early 80s. And he eventually found himself in jail on trumped up charges of financial mismanagement. And so I think in some ways his experience demonstrates the upper limits of kind of what you could try to do within the state, right? When he went too far, you know, judicial police arrested him in his INI office in Mexico City. And so, yeah, and then I think I'll maybe just speak to this one and we can open it up to other questions or comments from the audience. But the question of de-provincializing Mexico is a really good one. I mean, as you know, as you yourself as a scholar of Mexico know all too well, I think the history of Mexico is a very rich one, and the literature is I think, exciting, innovative one. But scholars of Mexico for many years could write lots of books about Mexico kind of without ever looking beyond the state, right? They just debate the nature of the state, the nature of the ruling party, and there was this idea that Mexico was somehow exceptional to broader trends in Latin America of civil wars and dictatorships. And so I think lots of people, younger historians, are trying to kind of de-provincialize that. I think it was understandable that the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and the post-revolutionary state attracted so much attention that I think for very understandable reasons that's why maybe historians were so kind of focused on Mexico as the singular experience. But I do think that it's worth thinking about how broader trends of, you know, Cold War political polarization or indigenous rights organizing, development, all of these things are hemispheric or global processes. And so it's worth us thinking about the resonances that Mexican history has, and also how Mexican history is being shaped, right? I mean, one of the presidencies that I'm particularly interested in, and you know a lot about, is that of Luis Echeverria from 1970 to 1976. I don't think you can understand his presidency without thinking about the global context. And so that's what I try to do in the book. And one other thing I would just say about that is, you know, Oaxaca is a place that is unique in Mexico, you know, is a kind of singular place. It is a place that is, you know, inspired and attracted me to spend, you know, large portions of my life there. But some of the literature on Oaxaca also reflects this kind of provincialism of saying, oh, Oaxaca is this one place, and this particular Oaxacan community is unlike any other community. And while I think there's some value in terms of looking at that specificity, I also think it's useful to think about how Oaxaca is a cosmopolitan place that reflects global trends as well. And so I try to capture some of that in the book. But I'll leave it at that. And if people want to raise other questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
I just wanted to give, and thank you, Shane, that, I mean, for your very rich answers. I wanted to give Yolanda another chance to maybe raise a couple more points. I don't know if Yolanda, if you wanted to add more to the conversation. You said you had more up your sleeve that you might want to share with Shane.
Okay, yes. I wanted to make a comment about how the history of indigenous education in Ecuador. This began in 1950s when the CONAIE, the National Organization for Indigenous Peoples, they decided to make the first march to reclaim the ancestral lands for indigenous peoples. It happens that before the haciendas, they were divided in small portions of land, and those portions of land were sold to the hacendados, to the landlords. And so, as you know, and as you are aware, for indigenous peoples, the land has a very important cultural meaning. And so that was one of the big fights in 1950s. In 1970, then comes the idea why we are teaching to our students concepts and non-indigenous education. And so there was Tránsito a Maguaña and Dolores Cacuango, both of them ladies, indigenous ladies from the north of Ecuador. They keep saying in every place, in several meetings, that we need really to teach our students, our philosophies, our songs, our thinking. This is why we are here to reclaim the existence of indigenous education. So Tránsito Amaguaña, she herself created 4 different indigenous schools in the north of Ecuador, in Cayambe. But she has to run those schools in a hidden mode. So during the night, they were teaching the students how to read and write, but somebody was really watching outside. If the police came, immediately they make a sound saying the police is coming. So when the police came and they tried to see if there were students or they were doing something, they didn't find anything. But at the end, they were able to cause Tránsito Amaguaña with this school. So she went to prison. And that is the beginning of the intercultural bilingual education. So many march discussions, meetings with the different ministers of education in Ecuador. And finally, in 1980s, it was created the first direction for intercultural education in whole Latin America. And so, yeah, and of course, what that means that we need to have teachers well prepared for that, for indigenous education, but that wasn't the reality. So we have more women trying to work as teachers, of course, trying to share with the students the indigenous knowledge and these things, but of course, we needed to have like methods for teaching. And so some countries like Cuba, sometimes Brazil, Colombia, they help and say, we need to give capacity building to the students. The other issue that I want to emphasize is never the indigenous teachers receive a good salary. For instance, in Ecuador, they only receive maybe a salary of $50, and if not, they give a bonus, $20 or $30 for the whole month of work. And so there are several needs in indigenous education, but also there are several gaps. And this is why lately we have been speaking that in different assemblies that we need to have a good education with quality and an education for life. And so that means a lot for us because we need to see our reality and we need to create a curriculum according to the needs of a specific geographical region. For instance, for the north, in the highlands would be something necessary. For the south, maybe we need to put more stress in organization. Also, this was touched in some pages in the book. And this is true, not only in Ecuador, but in different countries. Always the north is more organized than the south. So I don't know if I have time for another comment regarding to the research. Luis?
If you can make it very brief.
Yeah, very brief. No, just I want to say that would be very important to include indigenous peoples as co-participants in the research. I did my thesis in that way, and so I was the instrument for them to say what they wanted to say, and we corrected already together everything that I wrote, and we read the documents in Spanish, and then they said me, here is wrong, please correct that. So it was a collective effort. Just to say that to develop indigenous research takes more time, but would be very useful really to work in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. I mean, again, more food for thought for you, Shane. I don't know if you want to answer to that or if you want to open it up for questions from the audience. I leave it up to you.
Yeah, well, we can open it up, and I've written down some thoughts on Yolanda's comments. So we can open it up if you want to get a few other voices in or comments. Excellent. Or questions.
Okay, so please, to the audience, you can unmute yourselves and ask the question, or you can also use the raise your hand feature, or you can type your question in the chat box that you have available. Richard, please.
Yeah, I was interested in the section where you talk about sort of the rise of official multiculturalism, because I am sort of familiar with that neoliberal multicultural argument. And I guess what I was curious about is like, what are the benefits of official multiculturalism in the context of implementing neoliberal policies, which could remove investment in sort of welfare measures, including things like education. And then you said that one of the strategies you do is to center the agency of indigenous actors and their role in shaping these projects. And I guess I'm curious as to how you strike a balance between that agency and the sort of totalizing environment that development under neoliberal regimes creates. And I guess sort of like who has more sway, or how do you think about those two things in tension?
You want to respond to that, Shane, or do you want to collect?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you, Richard, for that very thoughtful comment and question. It's something that I've wrestled a lot with. I think, I mean, one of the things that I thought was important as I was kind of researching the 1970s and some of the kind of indigenous activism there, is that for many of these activists, they are concerned with both a politics that is about material improvement of their lives, that is, demands for state investment, demands for investment in education and development, for redistribution of land. They have kind of materialist demands. And they also have demands about the kind of racism that they have faced, that you could describe as kind of cultural demands about indigenous people's place in the country and the way in which education and policy has denigrated indigenous culture and language. And so they view those two things as intricately linked. Like they're not, they don't like have like their economic demands over here and their cultural demands over here. And they're like they're actually part of the way they understand an anti-colonial struggle, that anti-colonialism is a material struggle and a cultural struggle together. And they developed some ideas. And one of the many Oaxacan intellectuals who are kind of active in this period developed this kind of theory of comunalidad, or I don't know, English communality isn't a lovely translation, but this idea of basically a kind of politics of liberation that is focused on both cultural as well as material emancipation. And I think what happens is that, as you are kind of referencing in your question, is that governments accede to the cultural demands and they don't accede to the economic demands, right? I mean, they're like, yeah, we can give you bilingual education and we'll disinvest from these regions, and even indigenous autonomy can be kind of advantageous for us because it fits with our neoliberal agenda, which is to facilitate capital's movement rather than invest or try to mitigate existing inequalities. And so I think that's why people rightly, like anthropologist Charles Hale and others, describe neoliberal multiculturalism as this kind of effective strategy of neoliberal governance. But I think that it's worth us noting that neoliberalism delinked cultural and material demands. It wasn't like activists did that, but neoliberalism delinked those things. And I think that is, we don't have to accept that. We don't have to say, oh, it's one or the other, which I find, if you find yourself reading debates about which is more important, class or ethnicity or race, or these are very frustrating debates for me, because, nobody ever wins, and they end up, I don't know, we could have another conversation about that. So that's why I thought that politics in the 70s that saw these things as linked was important. And so I think just because neoliberalism delinks cultural and material demands doesn't mean that we had, that had to be the case. Wasn't the nature, of multiculturalism doesn't have to be neoliberal. I would argue it's not just a tautology, neoliberal multiculturalism. You could have a multiculturalism that's connected to movements for robust development, but we didn't get that. But it's worth us, I think, kind of resuscitating those previous historical experiences if we want to think about alternatives in the future. I don't want to take up too much more time, but your question is a really important one. Yeah, and I don't think it's helpful to just kind of say, look, Indigenous agency is everywhere. That's not what I'm interested in, but I am interested in this particular moment when people are thinking about cultural and material inequalities as linked. And that's part of this a global anti-colonial politics that's not just taking place in Latin America, but it's taking place in Africa, it's taking place in Asia. People are thinking about these things, that colonialism is a project of economic exploitation and also a project that is highly racialized and racist, and that we have to confront both of those things.
Let's see, do we have any... Oh, sorry, Richard, do you want to follow up?
I mean, just that was like an excellent response. You really, you're nailing sort of like the tension that I'm trying to get at. And I think like emphasizing that the politics of liberation contain both of these elements. Like I see like functionally for your argument in the book and as well as historically, that I think sort of attends to that problem by bringing them both together like that. Relinking what neoliberalism delinked through Indigenous actors, they can at least do that and remind us that these things shouldn't be separate. We shouldn't be having this versus identity politics debate over and over again. So it's good stuff.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Shane. Any other questions or comments, praise, criticism for our guest?
People found any typos in the book? I want to know about the typos.
So you could take that back to the press, right? Here we have a question from Monica Salas, a mutual friend of ours, who I'm glad is here in the audience. She says, congratulations. Thank you for the presentation. Congratulations on the fabulous book. I would like to ask you, what does the trajectory of the Instituto Nacional Indigenista, which you study so well, tell us more broadly about Priista rule and the state in the second half of the 20th century? Massive question from Dr. Salas.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a very sharp and smart question. Thank you, Monica, for being with us. And I think that, there's lots of things to say about this, but I think that the INI, the Instituto Nacional Indigenista, this Indigenous Development Agency, does help us think a lot about the history of this ruling party that dominates Mexican politics for most of the 20th century. And the INI is created in 1948. And so it, in some ways, is kind of at the height of, I think, pre kind of hegemony and rule. It is a project that has, the director of the INI is almost like a kind of cabinet level position. He has, direct meetings with the president. And it is, I think, early on part of a kind of robust state-led developmentalism that the PRI is committed to. Sometimes people describe the INI, even during this period, as the kind of caboose of the developmentalist train. That is, that while it's a kind of a federal agency that oversees, national development policy, it doesn't have the kind of same levels of investment as other kind of larger agricultural capital intensive projects that the federal government oversees, say in northern Mexico. But I think one way to think about the INI and what it tells us about the PRI is that for those first few decades of INI policy, it's run by anthropologists or archaeologists, but oftentimes by anthropologists who have, I think, fairly serious, academic credentials, and they're overseeing a pretty large federal agency. And as the PRI takes a turn towards more neoliberal policies at the, I would say, beginning at the end of the 1970s, even before the 1982 debt crisis, you see the leadership of the INI change as well. And so at the beginning, you have all these very accomplished academics, anthropologists, renowned, intellectuals who have a kind of global profile, Alfonso Caso, Aguirre Beltran, others. And then by the end of the 20th century, in the 1980s, what you see is a bunch of accountants running the INI. And so it kind of reflects the shift in the PRI as well, right? Instead of this kind of robust development that's a state-led development that has its own problems and contradictions, but at least the state's kind of invested in the questions of inequality. By the end of the INI's existence at the end of the 20th century, I mean, it changes names. There's still a version of the INI today, but it's run by accountants and engineers who don't really have a kind of broad social vision of social change. And so I think that certainly tells us something about the evolution of the PRI and the ruling party over the second half of the 20th century. Yeah, so there's more to say. I think one of the things early on is that in the INIs in the 1948, the early 1950s, other federal agencies like healthcare, agrarian reform, those are kind of getting off the ground. There's a time where the INI is this kind of, it's doing everything. It's doing public health, education, and agrarian reform and infrastructure. It's doing all these things. And over the next few decades, other federal agencies that are dedicated to those issues, they start to grow and expand. And so the INI is this agency that does everything, has a smaller place as where you see the kind of growth and diversification of the federal government. And so there's a kind of political shift in terms of the INI's role within the constellation of other federal agencies, I think that's worth thinking about. But certainly to be part of the INI was to be part of the PRI, whether you wanted to or not, for most of the 20th century. And so like the anthropologist that I mentioned, who found himself in trouble in the early 1980s, Salomon Namad, this was a guy who was basically a kind of left-wing member of the PRI, right? Who thought the PRI was useful for what he wanted to do, but he was a kind of left wing. The PRI was a big church, right? And so it had a left and a right and a center. And so, the left and leftist priistas, they start to lose out, in the early 1980s. Like they get pushed out, in one way or the other. Or you could think of Porfirio Muñoz Ledo as well, right? These types of more left-wing voices within the PRI, they're losing the institutional battles by the 1980s.
Thank you, Shane. Do we have any other questions or comments for Dr. Shane Dillingham? I think you have wowed the audience. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions or comments, there's already plenty of praise, not just for your work, Shane, but also for the conversation on the panel. So I think we can bring it to a close. I want to thank you again, Shane, for sharing your vision, right, of the book. Also for this interaction, I want to thank Yolanda Teran, Dr. Yolanda Teran, for just bringing just such a rich, personal, but also just this broader perspective on this conversation, which is, I think, also, it just kind of, it highlights, I think, Shane, the importance of the work that you've done with this book. And I think we all look forward to seeing what comes after, right? Now in your new position and exploring other aspects of indigenous history in the Americas. So again, thank you all in the audience for your presence, for your questions, your comments. Please stay tuned for more events from the Latin American and Iberian Institute, and please enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.